Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Anne Marie Adams, Assistant Director and alumna of the MSc class of 2011. I'm excited to be here today to talk with MSc alumna JaTaune Bosby, who is the Executive Director of the ACLU Alabama. From their website, the American Civil Liberties Union of Alabama is freedom's watchdog. They work in the courts, legislatures, and communities to defend the individual and personal freedoms guaranteed to us by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The ACLU is a private, nonprofit membership organization. Their mission is to preserve and protect the civil liberties and civil rights guaranteed by the US Constitution, especially the principles contained in the Bill of Rights. Among the issues they work on are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, government-sponsored religious activities, privacy, discrimination based on race, gender, sexual orientation or disability, police misconduct, censorship in schools or libraries, fairness and application of school discipline, workplace privacy, access to government documents, inhumane jail and prison conditions, and other issues of fair treatment by government. Welcome back, JaTaune, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. So if you can, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you all for joining. I know there's a little trouble getting on from what I heard. Now, of course, I thought this was webinar style, but I'm happy to see the boxes and the faces, a couple that are familiar. Anne Marie, thank you so much for the introduction. I am JaTaune Bosby, the Executive Director of the ACLU of Alabama. I am actually a native of the Chicagoland area and lived and went to school at the University of Alabama, Birmingham for undergrad, returned home, and that is where I completed my graduate studies at Northwestern in their MSc program. So just a little bit about me, kind of giving you the history of how I landed at MSc and where I am now. After undergrad in 2010, I needed to find a job. And so I landed at Northwestern's temp agency program and landed in the School of Communication. From there, in that program, I served as basically an admin in a sense, and then discovered the MSc program when Stacy Zake was the director. About a year and a half of working there, I ended up applying to the program and got in. And so I was working in SOC and then also a student of MSc, so supporting faculty and staff, and then also being a student was quite an experience for me. I think it provided me some real perspective on the work, particularly in organizational communication and what that looked like, and also really provided the perspective of the academia and seeing many of the folks that I was supporting operating in their wheelhouse as professors. So that was a good experience for me then. After leaving Northwestern, I started at a PR firm for a very short stint. And then from there, worked in Chicago's North Lawndale community at a behavioral health organization. And I think that that was a real pivotal time in my career as a young professional, supported the leadership team in that organization that was really a phenomenal community public health agency. And from there, really kind of gained my footing on what leadership looked like. I think in a small nonprofit that was very impactful. And from there, I was recruited to the ACLU of Alabama to operate as their director of development and a fundraiser, essentially. And about 6 years in, I've had some time here and was selected as the executive director in 2020, in August of 2020. So I think that's a long story to kind of tell you where I've landed here now.
Thanks. So if we can, let's talk generally first. Tell us a little bit about the ACLU Alabama. As executive director, what is a typical, if there is such a thing, a typical week like for you?
So there's not such a thing as a typical week for me as an executive director. So as you shared, Anne Marie, we work in three ways: legislative advocacy, which is advancing civil liberties, community organizing, informing people of their rights and helping elevate social action towards structural change in the state, and in the courts by protecting the civil rights of individuals. So the ACLU has 6 areas of focus: criminal legal reform, immigrants' rights, reproductive freedom and abortion access, voting rights, LGBTQ equality, and digital privacy. Um, and the ACLU of Alabama focuses really on 3 of those areas: voting rights, criminal legal reform, and abortion access. And I also want to name LGBTQ equality. And really, we thread that needle of reproductive freedom, abortion access, and LGBTQ equality under gender justice and focusing on medical autonomy. So those are our real core areas. And people are like, well, how do you select those areas? So when you are working in a state that is has a very, what I would frame as a regressive legislature, there are constantly individuals who are pushing bills that impede or attack the civil rights and civil liberties of individuals in the state. And those are the 3 or 4 primary areas that we are constantly seeing. And so that is how we have elevated that as our priorities. And so we just ended legislative session on May 17th. And so now we are, after a historical election, we have to think about what equitable redistricting lines look like for legislative and congressional lines. And so that is the work that we are focusing on. So whether I am connecting with a elected official, a municipal official, or really thinking through some of our broader strategy around voting rights and redistricting, it varies. But that is the work that really kind of lays the foundation for what I do with the ACLU, providing the strategic direction of the organization with a staff of 11 and also supporting a nonprofit board of 21 members. So that is a bit of a lay of the land of my work.
The work you're doing is so important. And, you know, hearing you speak just now, it's clear that there's so many facets to it. How has your academic and professional training supported your work?
So much of my work is steeped in strategic thinking and relationship building, change management, organizational communication. Of course, all of you know that these are very, very familiar things. Going to school in Alabama in undergrad, I was able to get some perspective. I was able to understand the culture and how things worked here. And my graduate degree, I think, is really what allowed me to skill up, if you will, in navigating organizational systems in those particular areas. So when we think about the various courses, right, managing global teams, Professor David Bernal, leveraging networks, Professor Contractor, leadership and decision-making, change management with Professor Roloff. These are just some of kind of the core areas that I work in on a regular basis that have been really pivotal and integral in my work and where I've landed now. It's a culmination of everything that I have learned and the things that I continue to learn and do. So I think that probably wraps it up, but it's a lot, but it's very, very rewarding to be really working in the areas that you've studied. So
Some of the professors you named were some of my favorites when I was in the program. So it's always good to hear about how you're kind of plugging in the lessons and theories into your work. When you're responding, though, to incidents that are public, rather than ones that the ACLU is directly involved with, what are some of the ways your communications team collaborates and makes decisions? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
yeah, so I think the ACLU generally has a very clear communication style. So if you are following the ACLU of Illinois or whatever state that you're in, your local affiliate probably has some general, not phrasing, but messaging. We will see you in court, right? If you sign this bill, if you pass this law, we will see you in court. And so we are very affirmative in how we operate as an organization and very clear. And so I think that really trickles down to our communication efforts. I'll use an example In 2018, on Thanksgiving Day, a situation that happens all too often, a young man by the name of E.J. Bradford was shot and killed by a police department in Alabama. And that day, we had to come out with a statement that was very clear around this incident, and we did. And then after the Attorney General and the district attorney in that county really did a further investigation, we continued to have to come out with very clear statements. But what that led to was a partnership with the NAACP, understanding and building rapport, of course, with the attorney representing the family, and a broader campaign and initiative around use of force policies for the police departments across the state. And this allowed us to build a broader campaign around policing and divestment that we have seen take shape over the last 4 years. So I think that this is an example of, we don't just come out with language or messaging. We have to come out with language or messaging that leads to real action, that leads to campaign, that leads to social change. And I think that that's really important when you're particularly in this work. It's not just like a crisis response. It must be followed up with real action. So,
as you think about the social change that you mentioned, I want to dig in a little bit deeper. Would you talk a bit about what it's like to lead an organization through a time of civil unrest, like the March 13th killing of Breonna Taylor, the May 25th, 2020 state murder of George Floyd, the DC riots on January 26th of this year, and so many others?
I think that's a really important question, and I thank you for asking it. I'd like to reframe it a bit. I believe I'm leading in a time where we are seeing the next iteration of the civil rights movement. Right, so leading in a time of civil unrest is one thing. Leading in the time of the next civil rights movement, I think, provides a lot more context as to what my responsibility is as a leader. And so being based, I'm in Alabama, but for clarity, I'm in Montgomery, Alabama, which is the birthplace of the modern civil rights movement. And so the importance of that is that when you are in a space where we are not far removed from the modern civil rights movement, we just recently celebrated the 65th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott just this year. And so it really allows you to have broader perspective of what movement work is, being proximate to communities you are serving, understanding where the power lies, to use a Fred Hampton quote, where there's people, there's power. And I think that has been one of my greatest lessons during this time, is understanding the true arc of where we are. And I would say that in this work, you are required to talk to movement leaders. So I don't just operate from the frame of the ACLU, I am operating from the frame of where I am situated as a leader. And so recently I was at an event with a woman who's a movement leader by the name of LaTosha Brown. And you all may have heard this name. If you've heard of Stacey Abrams, you have likely heard of LaTosha Brown, who really focuses on that Black political power building. And one of the key things that learning and listening is vision. You have to have vision. You have to have an understanding of what this world looks like if it was equitable, for people not to live in fear of being Black or brown or trans. And in envisioning that, you have to operate in that vision and actively work to create that world. And so that is what I have learned the most during these times, seeing this firsthand, being a person who is Black, being a person who is leading Black and brown and queer staff. And that requires more of me. And so I think that is where we really have to be more keen about how we look at things and be more acute in our strategy.
Can you talk a bit about some of the challenges that you've faced in your role, or some of the obstacles that you've overcome, and how you've done that?
Yeah, I think I'm always asking, am I doing this right? Is this the right thing to do? Has this, and a lot of what they say is imposter syndrome. The thing that has been really beneficial to me is that I've had really great mentors. I have really great sponsors. And I was really fortunate enough to be able to work under some phenomenal leaders before I became one. Um, and that has provided me, I think, a very solid foundation. And so I am constantly learning from those around me and actively working to be someone who is a student of this work. And so when you are thinking through what new leadership structures look like in a post-COVID world, I am constantly thinking about what dismantling, what deconstructing, and what disrupting traditional leadership structures look like during this time. And so that provides me, I think, a clearer path of what not only, these lessons, am I doing it right, but um, what does a new leader look like? A new leader that looks like me, a new leader that I am creating space for, and that is the path that I need to forge. And I think that that has been one of my biggest lessons in these experiences over time.
You've talked a bit while you've been with us today about the listening and learning. How have you continued your own continued learning and skill advancement in your career?
I think that what is critical is just, I mean, the listening piece. I think you have to listen and learn. My former CEO is on the call, so I have to name her Dr. Sanel Lewis. But this is what has been a really great example is the fact that people can be very transparent with you about their experiences, so you learn from those experiences. I think I also shared a story when I remember losing my job. I was terminated from a position after 6 months, and I was very scared. It was a time where I was very fearful. I didn't know what to feel. Are people going to judge me? And as much as I learned at MSC, I learned equally as much from my fellow cohort members. So I remember during this time, I happened to have a coffee with Barb Black, who is on this call, and I told her, and I didn't tell anyone, no one knew outside of my family, and she just shared with me. She shared with me some of her experiences and things and really helped me navigate some of my next steps. And I think that that has been so critical in this learning piece is you have to understand and be a student and also be willing to receive. So as much as I listen, I also have to be willing to share and be willing to be vulnerable and be willing to build trust, to receive the things that people are willing to share with you, to really help you elevate to your next level.
Thinking about, giving advice as you have received it from colleagues, and I love to hear the feedback that you've gotten from your classmates in the class of 2013. As anti-racism DEI work has become increasingly sought after, what advice would you give folks interested in specializing in this field?
So I think that what is important is that I have a lot of opinions about this, but what is important is our work externally must be congruent with our work internally. So after this time, we saw a lot of what I would call uh, actions that were very performative, right? You can put out a quote, you can do a beautiful graphic, but it must align with your work internally. And what does that look like internally? I think is the real question. Is if you are not pipelining people and your leadership structure is not one that is equitable, is not one that is not only racially diverse, but diverse in many ways, particularly with marginalized community or folks who live on the margins, then I think we need to totally rethink this work that we're doing in these times. Because DEI work is not just focused on one group, it is focused on a number of protected classes and individuals who have traditionally been marginalized in this country. And so our work in DEI is not only to right size and to build equitability in these spaces, it is to be able to listen to individuals that are directly impacted. It is to center their voices, and it is to ensure that they are being heard, that the feedback is being received and that there is some direct action taking place within your workforce, right? And so I think that the broader conversation around DEI needs to be about that, is to center individuals, their stories, and to work internally to ensure that what you were saying and what you are investing in externally is happening inside of your organization, right? That's the real growth. And so when we can have real conversations about race and oppression and how this affects the LGBTQ community, individuals who identify as other religions, such as Muslim or Sikh or others, you just have to ensure that we are doing that real root work internally. And so I think that that is really important in the DEI conversations moving forward in this next decade, quite honestly.
As I listen to you and learn more about the work that you're doing, it's clear the mental and emotional labor that you're investing in your work. And it's making me wonder, although people involved in every profession and volunteer work can be susceptible to vocational burnout, I know that research suggests that social justice and human rights activists whose activist work is fraught with unique challenges can be especially susceptible to it. So my question for you is, how do you take care of yourself and your team as you do this work?
So I think this is really important. What I try to make sure that I'm doing is a lot of these systems are built not with folks that are actively working with them in mind. And so I have to make sure that I am not perpetuating these practices of white supremacy and racism, even in how I'm operating as a leader. And so for me, what I think is also missing is that oftentimes we look and we celebrate folks at certain levels, but we are not looking at the groundwork that is being laid, right? The folks, particularly the reason that happens in social justice and social advocacy work is people who are organizing on the ground are oftentimes those who are most directly impacted. And those are the individuals that that oftentimes are not paid as much as certain folks in organizations. They are often not centered, and they are often required to do a lot of work while also working to define and protect their own humanity. And so what I have learned in this is not only, and I say this often, you must extend grace and you must receive it. And so whatever I can do as a leader to ensure that I am not just protecting, but centering my staff and centering their concerns and centering the voices of the most impacted folks, I think that that is really the first step, because it is tiring, right? And I think some people would not call it a burden or a sacrifice, because this is the necessary work that needs to be done, right? Because this is the vision that we are all collectively creating. But that is probably my biggest one. I think extending grace has been the way that I think through self-care, if you will.
Yeah, extending grace to self and everyone around you. So if we can, thank you for answering my questions, JaTaune. I want to take some questions from the audience with the time we have left. Judith from this year's class has asked, you mentioned mentors. How did you find your mentors, and are they in your field?
I have found mentors, yes. And as I shared, mentors in previous roles that I'm constantly soundboarding with. And then I would say unlikely mentors and sponsors, individuals that take time to have taken time to invest in me, which I'm appreciative of. But that also comes with a level of fostering a relationship, right? You have to take an initiative. It has to be a 360 relationship. It has to be reciprocal. And so they've come organically, and they've also come by me actively seeking them out. So I think it varies. What I like to do is ensure that I am putting myself in position where I am ensuring that the conversations that I'm having with people are fostering some type of relationship in which it could be a mentor-mentee, or it can just be someone who is part of what I like to call my own personal board. of directors. And that is what I've done and tried to create. But that's just a little bit, because they're really invaluable. And I must differentiate, and I say this all the time, but the mentorship and the sponsor piece, right? So you have mentors, people who guide you, people who are your soundboards, and you have sponsors. And sponsors are the individuals that really open up the doors, that are able to really give the opportunity, that are able to advocate for you. And so I think that it's important to find both and to know what both are, and to be able to clearly identify them as well.
Love the differentiation between both pieces, mentor and sponsor. We have a question from Bob Rowley. He says, MSc 13 classmate of mine, I am so proud, if I can say that, and grateful for your work in such a historic place in the movement that I remember advocating for as a teen in the 60s. So much time has passed and we are still fighting for the same thing. Much progress has been made, honestly, but so much work remains to be done. His question is, can you please talk about allies and how, for example, there were 500 demonstrations last year on June 6th for Black Lives Matter, and many of them had more whites than Blacks. How can your white colleagues help, and how can we be sensitive to our privilege and still effective as allies and advocates?
I think that's a great question when we talk about allies and advocates. And I think that allies have to, the stepping up and stepping back, when you leverage your privilege and understand the importance of that. Sometimes leveraging privilege means centering someone else, right? And it may not center you, and you may not get what one may regard as an accolade for it, but it is the importance of being consistent in that allyship. Showing up to a demonstration is one thing, making sure that you are calling your legislator or having that conversation with a friend or someone that may not have an understanding, but ensuring that you are living that through your actions consistently is important. Because I think that we have an assumption that if I show up, then this is enough. And maybe in some context, that may be what you are able to do within your capacity. But I think we have to think through our ideas of what that privilege is, right? Because many of us hold it. What am I doing financially? What am I doing to advance this individual, this person, this group? How am I checking myself? How am I checking my privilege? And how am I being consistent in my practices and beliefs across the board in every aspect of my life? I think is important, because we cannot do this work alone. It is a collective effort. It's a collective effort because liberation is for us all. And Bob, thank you so much for that question. Love you dearly for your leadership as well. So thank you.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? Feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask. Oh, okay.
We have
Let me
some
see.
questions in the chat.
Yes. We have a question from Joy Fleming. She says, I work for a large organization who has been actively and aggressively making strides to demonstrate allyship by mindfully seeking out diverse talent and adopting retention strategies. This is now being challenged by some white colleagues who question the balance and fairness of driving these efforts. Comments on reverse discrimination are bubbling up. How would you advise how she, as a leader and person of color in her organization, respond when leaders with more power pull back from the initiatives that are doing the work to support diversity, equity, and equality efforts?
I think that is I think that's what a lot of people are navigating right now. I'm not a DEI expert, but what I can tell you is I will tell you based on my perspective. Racism is a power structure, right? And so that is why it's foundational. We have to understand who have historically been in positions of power and what we're doing to right-size that. And I think that once we get a better understanding of that, we can actually move forward. I think it's more difficult when you're in a large organization and there are hierarchical dynamics that you have to navigate as an individual. What I think is important oftentimes is to bring in an expert. I think that it is one thing as a person of color or an impacted person or anyone from protected class, whether you're LGBTQ, whether you identify as, another religion, race, marginalized group, doing this work as an employee is oftentimes inadequate. It's good to spearhead as an individual, but it is oftentimes inadequate because of everything else that you are trying to manage. So what I would suggest is bringing in these subject matter experts to navigate those individuals, because honestly, that is not your burden and that is not your fight. Your fight is to ensure you are helping create this pipeline, helping to build this type of retention, but the conversation about race discrimination is a deeper construct that an individual needs to have. They need to pay someone to come in and have those conversations. That should not be the burden, in my opinion, of individuals who are actively trying to move this work forward in organizations. And I think that has really been why we have been more stagnant in creating those pipelines, is because we are not tapping into individuals who are actual DEI experts to have those real conversations, honestly, and you as an employee not receiving that blowback, right, and not holding that burden. So that would be my suggestion to you, because there's foundational work that is truly probably above what we hold, I think, oftentimes as employees in large orgs.
JaTaune, we have a question from Patricia Reese. She says, I love your comments about vision and would love to hear more about your process of building a vision and then how you go about bringing your team and your work or other community along to adopting or implementing that vision, especially in the world of policy and communications, where visions often compete and clash.
I think this is great. So I'll just share a bit. It will be 6 years I've been with my organization. And before being executive director, I had to go through a nationwide search process, like every other candidate. And I had to come with a real vision. And my vision was really based on my experiences. I had to have a lot of conversations with people, and I presented that vision once I was hired to my staff. And in building that vision, I also understood where in this decision-making structure was I directing them, was I consulting them, was it a joint decision-making process? I think what I needed was feedback. And so for me, I could build a beautiful vision, but if there is not consensus, if there is not, and I wouldn't even say consensus, if there is not buy-in from the individuals that are supposed to help you execute your vision, it's kind of, it is ineffective. And so even though I built a vision, I made sure that I solicited feedback from my staff, and oftentimes from my strategic and community partners, to have an understanding of how I can how we can further bolster a robust vision that is holistic, that is complete, that is collective, and that brings everyone together. So we can build a vision, but what is important is openly soliciting feedback and helping to build a culture of trust building where people can provide that feedback openly and without the fear of retaliation or backlash. And I think that is where you kind of get the difference in the policy and the communications piece, is because it is that trust building that is important in building out the vision.
We have a question from a current student, Kat Wheelahan. She said, following up on Joy's point, we are developing a great DEI literacy at my office, and equity is now an organizational objective. However, participation in DEI events and learning opportunities amongst, she says, the white dudes remains extremely low, despite the fact that everyone professes to care about the work and believe in its importance. All of the outgroup members at my office already know what the problems are. How do we mobilize and engage the white folks as advocates and allies? They're not anti, they just don't prioritize.
Right, so are we saying that they are just they're not invested in the movement?
Mm-hmm.
So we have to use who is invested in the movement. So I mean, I'll be honest, I think that we talk about allyship, we talk about individuals and then bringing along, people may not come along the way that we want them to come along at the time that we need them to come along. But what is required of us is to mobilize the people who are ready to move. And I think that is what the focus may need to be. You can do many conversations, you can have articles, lessons, but if people are not ready to receive that, if they are operating from their lived experience, then that is what people are operating from. If they are not in position to have a deeper understanding of what these challenges are, I think about legislators in our state, right? And you always have people who are going to not share the ideology of the ACLU. You're going to have staff who don't share the ideology of the ACLU, but that doesn't mean we cannot actively work towards what our goal is. But our goal is always to mobilize the people who are ready to make the change. And it's not just like, okay, we leave those people behind. It is, you can inform them, but you have to focus and put the energy investment into those who are ready to move. Now, if there are certain dynamics where those particular, like the white folks in this particular case, are leadership, again, I would have to refer back to really navigating that and to determine what are the things that you can leverage and what are the things you're willing to put on the line, because that is really what happens. There is a level of obligation as individuals that we have, and then we also have to think of what are our trade-offs? What are we willing to trade off on? And think through that, I think, strategically with those who are in this process and in this movement with us.
We have a great question from Taryn Smith O'Neill. She says, thank you for sharing your experience with us. As a DEI and communications professional, I've recently heard the term accomplice used more often by people who typically aren't working in the DEI space, implying that allyship is not enough. What are your thoughts around the terms ally versus accomplice?
Yeah, Taryn, as I shared, I am not a DEI expert. I think allyship and accomplice, I would have to really understand how people are framing accomplice. And I'm assuming you have to be standing side by side with someone, right? You have to be a partner in this work because allyship oftentimes isn't enough. But without, I think, a more nuanced perspective of what accomplice is, I don't think I can really give, I don't think a substantive response to that.
Bob Rowley is asking, can you talk about the ACLU Southern Collective you co-created and how its work happens across the South? Do you have much resistance in those 12 Southern states, for example? Is it still the most pushback nationally to the ACLU's work across the nation and still the locus of so much white grievance and supremacy?
Mm-hmm. And so, Bob, I think this is a great question. So we know that the South is ground zero, oftentimes, for the most egregious civil rights violations and civil liberties violations. And so what the Southern Collective does is bring about the 12 executive directors, leaders, and staff in these states, and we work on a collective vision around some of those core issues, around voting rights, around reproductive freedom and abortion access, and criminal legal reform. And so we created the Southern Voting Project during election season, where we focused heavily on what the impact of messaging of core community groups that we needed to invest in and build out as one, right, as a region. And I will be honest with you, when we talk about white supremacy, if you are working in the South, there is a deep understanding of that work. And I will say that the ACLU has, in the last, at least in its most recent years, been very invested in the work of anti-oppression and being very strategic in the folks that we are bringing in to talk about this type of work. And those who work in the South have real perspective of what that is. And so when you are centering those individuals who have that perspective, it's easier to be able to push a collaborative effort that folks can get on board with. But really it was to build some networks amongst the South, because we are oftentimes under-resourced. We don't have all the tools that we need. And so there is a strategic investment from the National ACLU to focus on the Southern Collective, which has been extremely beneficial. And we are seeing the root work of that. As you all know, the ACLU of Georgia, who changed the face of the nation, right? But really, those are some examples. It wasn't just the Georgia ACLU affiliate, right? It was the decades-long power building, Black political power building, organizers on the ground that helped develop and create this type of structure. But the ACLU, we are now as an organization understanding that and making that deep investment in this region. And I think that we will be all the better for it.
JaTaune, just to follow up, there are hundreds of voting laws being promulgated by the Republican Party. Their whole strategy is not to promote conservative policies, but to stop Black and brown people from voting. And are you gearing up also for 2022 and 2024? And is the Southern Collective going to be one of the pieces of that struggle to join Stacey Abrams in Georgia and the people in Texas who are trying to fight these laws that it's really, I mean, it reminds me of, Jim Crow #2. How do you prevent Black people from voting? Which is just, how do we get to be in this position now? And how do you fight it? Sorry, I go on and on with my questions.
No, because I know that this is a very critical topic. These are omnibus bills, right? So these are not bills that are created in a silo. These are bills that are constructed and created as a strategic way to minimize access, to obliterate access, particularly in Black and brown communities, and in Black communities, Black rural communities in the South. And so we as an organization have to be strategic in what we're doing, right? So we've already filed suit in Georgia, yes, active lobbying and legislative advocacy efforts across the South, but understanding that we are fighting these bills in court because that is a way by which we have to navigate that. But also with a critical understanding that this policy work is not just built in the Georgia legislature and the Mississippi legislature and the Alabama legislature. This is a real constructed strategic effort across the board. And that is what we're seeing. And so, yes, the Southern Collective is doing that. And so the next iteration of our Southern Voting Project is focusing on redistricting because we do need to create equitable legislative and congressional lines if we are going to really make inroads and continue this political power building. Because honestly, the truth of the matter is we are doing it as the ACLU, but organizers, community organizers will do this work regardless. They will do it off season, they will do it during an election, and we want to ensure we are not parachuting in and telling them, but really being informed by their strategy and effort. So that it all goes into the work that we're doing and really the political power building that we are in, that we are dovetailing during these next really 6 years. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, JaTaune. Those were all of the questions that we had today. On behalf of the MSc program, I want to thank JaTaune Bosby for being with us today and sharing so much of her work and the ACLU Alabama. And I'm going to put into the chat some information. In 2 weeks, Professor Rick Morris will be talking about a paper he wrote that discusses the futility of trying to regulate social media. You can sign up at the link in the chat. But again, I want to thank JaTaune for being with us today and sharing so much of her important work. Excuse me. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you. And feel free to contact me. I put my information in the chat. So if you would like to email me and talk further, I would be happy to hear from all of you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, JaTaune.
Thank you.